The freezing autumn rain lashed against the bulletproof glass of the obsidian room, blurring the chaotic Manhattan skyline. Inside, the climate control maintained a perfect, insulated warmth, the air thick with the scent of white truffles, seared Wagyu beef, and expensive sandalwood cologne. Elena Vance stood quietly near the service corridor. The stiff cotton of her apron was a stark contrast to the heavy velvet drapes and polished mahogany paneling. Her arches throbbed from an utter shift of catering to untouched billionaires, but her mind remained hypervigilant. Sharpened by years as a forensic auditor, she didn't just observe the dining room. She actively mapped a grid of moving parts, calculating unspoken power dynamics. At the absolute center of that sensory grid sat Salvatore Moretti. Occupying the corner VIP booth, he was the unmistakable gravitational center of the room. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that draped flawlessly over his broad shoulders, radiating a cold authority that naturally silenced nearby tables. A platinum Patek Philippe rested on his left wrist as he slowly turned a crystal glass between his scarred fingers. He was waiting for a meeting, his stillness predatory and deeply unsettling. Elena wiped down a silver tray with a linen cloth, her sharp eyes darting across the geometry of the room. Her internal cognitive loop, usually reserved for tracking missing millions in offshore shell companies, now obsessively tracked the subtle shifts in the restaurant's spatial arrangement, noting the exact positioning of the exits. That was the exact moment the environmental anomaly registered. The heavy brass front doors opened, allowing a brief gust of freezing wind to disrupt the warm air before Arthur Gable frantically hurried to seal them shut. Arthur, the subservient restaurant manager, bowed his head to the new arrivals, oblivious to the lethal tension they brought inside. 5 men stepped in from the rain. They wore tailored wool coats that hung slightly asymmetrical to conceal heavy weaponry. Elena's trained eyes instantly caught the discrepancy. Their gait was fundamentally wrong. Wealthy patrons walked with careless entitlement, assuming the world would move out of their way. These men moved with tight, kinetic precision, rapidly scanning the blind spots of the room. Elena's breath hitched, a cold drop of sweat tracing a slow line down her spine. She watched as the men dispersed with military efficiency. 2 drifted smoothly toward the heavy velvet curtains, effectively blocking the private service exit. A 3rd man took a casual position at the mahogany bar, his cold eyes fixed entirely on the antique mirror's reflection. The remaining 2 moved in a slow pincer formation toward the perimeter of Salvatore's booth, cutting off his line of sight to the main entrance behind a large floral arrangement. Her pupils dilated, adjusting to the sudden spike of adrenaline, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Through a gap in the patrons, she recognized the sharp, brutal profile of the man at the bar. He was a known lieutenant for Viktor Petrov, an arrogant rival faction leader seeking to usurp Salvatore's territory through direct physical violence. This was not a late dinner reservation. This was a tactical cage rapidly closing in on a man who sat completely unaware that his perimeter had just been fatally breached. Arthur Gable scurried past Elena, his face pale and shining with nervous perspiration. He smoothed his lapels, completely blind to the orchestrated execution being set up right in the middle of his Michelin-starred dining room, ignoring the undeniable reality of the wolves pacing among the tables. Elena pressed her spine against the cold steel of the industrial espresso machine, her mind racing through a hyper-vigilant calculation of crossfire lines and inevitable casualties. She was just a waitress. The safest action was to slip out through the kitchen loading dock and let the violent underworld consume its own apex predators. She had already lost her professional career and financial stability, forced into this exhausting low-wage purgatory just to survive. Why risk her life for a ruthless man who didn't even know her name? But as she looked back, she saw Salvatore calmly checking the dial of his watch. He was a solitary figure caught in a gilded trap, completely exposed. Her forensic intellect, which always demanded strict order and absolute justice, violently rebelled against the incoming slaughter. She could not just let a massacre unfold in front of her. Elena turned sharply toward the digital point-of-sale terminal. Her fingers trembled, a raw biological response to extreme violence, before she forced them to steady through sheer willpower. She punched in the table number and printed the itemized receipt for his booth. The thermal machine churned out the crisp white paper, detailing the expensive vintage wine and the heavy cost of high society indulgence. She reached under the steel counter and pulled out a polished black leather folder, the standard presentation book reserved for the most elite clientele. Opening the heavy folder, she smoothed the receipt flat against the dark, textured backing and pulled a standard red ballpoint pen from her apron. Normally meant for marking dietary requests, tonight it would serve as an emergency, life or death broadcast. Her eyes darted back to the dining floor. The enforcer near the bar shifted his weight, his large hand subtly sliding beneath his coat lapel. The heavy bulge of a shoulder holster was unmistakable. The timeline was rapidly collapsing. She calculated that she had less than 2 minutes before the first suppressed round shattered the delicate crystal. Elena bent low over the dark presenter, her breathing shallow and tightly controlled. She scanned the printed text of the receipt, her auditor's brain rapidly isolating the necessary letters and words hidden within the elaborate menu descriptions. She pressed the red pen to the paper, aggressively circling the word gun from the burgundy wine description, dragging the bold red line down to encompass man from a mandarin glazed side dish. Her hand moved with desperate precision as she circled behind you, deal, gone, wrong, and exit now from the fine print and footer notes. The coded bill stared back at her from the dark binding. Against the innocent white paper, the heavy red ink looked violently urgent, bleeding onto the page like bright red blood pooling on pristine white marble. Gunman behind you. Deal gone wrong. Exit now. It was a massive, suicidal gamble. If Salvatore missed the desperate message, or assumed it was a meaningless mistake by a careless server, the enforcers would butcher him right in his velvet seat. If Viktor Petrov's men realized what she was doing and intercepted the message, they would simply shoot her first, leaving her to bleed out on the imported marble floor without a second thought. Elena closed the leather folder, the soft snap of the magnetic clasp echoing loudly like a gunshot in her own ears. Her knees felt weak, a suffocating dread settling deep in her stomach, but she aggressively locked her jaw. She was not a porcelain doll. She had survived far too much systemic abuse and financial ruin to let arrogant and cowardly violence win without a fight. Picking up a polished silver tray, she placed the leather folder dead center, ensuring it was perfectly aligned. She adjusted her posture, smoothing the cheap cotton of her apron, and stepped boldly out from the protective shadows of the server station. The freezing rain continued to batter the reinforced glass outside, entirely oblivious to the lethal silence stretching tight inside the dining room. She kept her eyes forward, walking straight toward the epicenter of the threat. The dining room floor of the obsidian room felt impossibly wide. Elena Vance moved with frictionless grace, absorbing the rich atmosphere thick with the scent of seared Wagyu beef and vintage champagne. Around her, the metropolitan elite continued their luxurious ignorance, unaware that the room had fundamentally shifted into a hostile combat zone. Arthur Gable, the perpetually nervous manager, was busy fawning over a local politician. His obsession with reputation left his staff unprotected, but Elena had learned long ago not to rely on anyone else for survival. Every step toward the VIP booth was calculated with forensic precision. Her mind, hardwired by years of dissecting fraudulent ledgers, mapped the exact spatial geometry of the impending ambush. To her left, an enforcer at the mahogany bar subtly adjusted his grip on a lowball glass. To her right, 2 heavily built men flanked the velvet curtains, permanently blocking the private service exit. She kept her chin lowered in subservient obedience, her peripheral vision working in overdrive to catalog the threat. The soft jazz playing through the concealed speakers felt like a mocking soundtrack to the violence building in the shadows. The polished silver tray felt heavier than solid lead, beneath the cheap cotton of her apron. A sharp spike of adrenaline caused a fine tremor to vibrate through her wrists. She forcefully suppressed it, deliberately slowing her breathing. Every muscle in her back ached from a grueling double shift, but the primal instinct to survive overrode her exhaustion. She mentally retreated into clinical detachment, treating the armed men simply as variables in an equation she was actively rewriting. As she closed the final distance to the VIP booth, The two enforcers, attempting a synchronized pincer formation, took a quiet step forward. Their tailored wool coats shifted just enough to reveal the unmistakable dark matte finish of shoulder holsters. They were systematically cutting off the final visual angle to the front entrance. Elena smoothly sidestepped a patron, dripping in diamonds, masking the desperate biological urge to drop the tray and sprint for the kitchen doors. She'd reached the perimeter of Salvatore Moretti's secluded booth. The localized silence surrounding him was profound, an insulated bubble, separate from the clinking silverware. The Mafia Don sat perfectly still. The rich scent of his sandalwood cologne mixed sharply with the metallic tang of her fear. His broad shoulders filled the tailored dark suit with an intimidating solidness, and the faint scars tracing his knuckles hinted at a history forged in uncompromising survival. He was an absolute predator masquerading as a high society guest. "Your final check, sir," Elena murmured, her voice a soft whisper modulated to blend into the ambient noise. She slid the leather folder onto the polished mahogany table, placing it precisely next to his baccarat crystal water glass. Salvatore reached out with a slow, deliberate grace, his scarred fingers grazing the dark binding. Elena did not step back into the shadows. Breaking the cardinal rule of high-end hospitality, she remained standing firmly at the edge of his table, planting her left hand against the cold wood to anchor her trembling body. That single insubordinate anchor caused Salvatore to pause. The heavy platinum Patek Philippe on his wrist caught the candlelight as his movement halted. He slowly lifted his head, his calculating dark eyes locking onto hers. The sheer weight of his stare carried the ruthless authority of an underworld king who commanded absolute obedience. A wave of primal intimidation threatened to buckle her knees, but her forensic intellect refused to yield. She would not break under the stare of one dangerous man. Elena maintained perfect, unyielding eye contact. Through the narrow gap between the elaborate floral arrangements, she saw the enforcer at the bar slip his hand deep inside his coat. She subtly pressed her index finger against the top of the leather folder. It was a microscopic tap that screamed for him to open it immediately, before she took a single agonizing step back. Salvatore's expression remained an impenetrable mask, but the profound stillness of his body changed. The casual ease of a billionaire vanished instantly, replaced by the hyper-vigilant tension of a seasoned tactician. He absorbed the precise nature of her silent rebellion. A simple waitress did not demand his attention in such a reckless, defiant manner, unless the rules of the room had already been shattered. With a smooth, practiced motion, he flipped open the magnetic clasp. Against the standard black ink of the itemized receipt, the violent red circles Elena had drawn stood out with screaming urgency. Salvatore's gaze tracked the precise lines of the coded bill. His sharp mind instantly decoded the fragmented letters she had pulled from the Burgundy wine descriptions and the fine print. "Gunman behind you. Deal gone wrong. Exit now." For one agonizing heartbeat, the dining room seemed to freeze in suspended time. Elena stood a few feet away with her empty tray pressed to her stomach like a fragile shield. Salvatore did not flinch in shock or look around the room in panic. Instead, his pupils dilated rapidly as a massive surge of tactical adrenaline hit his system. The scarred muscles in his jaw locked into a rigid line of absolute stone. He knew exactly what the red ink meant. The high-level negotiation he had been waiting for was a phantom setup. Viktor Petrov had bypassed diplomatic channels for a direct decapitation strike right in the heart of Manhattan. The men surrounding him were a highly coordinated ambush squad, meant to leave no survivors. Salvatore casually reached across the table, picking up his crystal glass as if simply savoring an expensive vintage. As he brought the rim to his lips, his dark eyes cut sideways, utilizing the reflective surface of a polished silver ice bucket. Through the distorted reflection, he mapped the tactical grid Elena had deciphered. He saw the two men permanently blocking the private service exit and registered the slow pincer movement, closing in on his blind spots. His own highly paid security detail stationed outside had been silently compromised. A brilliant, impoverished woman had just handed him the blueprint of his own impending assassination right under the noses of his rivals. Slowly, Salvatore set the crystal glass back onto the mahogany wood. He let out a low, controlled breath, and reached into the inner pocket of his bespoke Italian jacket, moving with the casual elegance of an executive retrieving a premium cigar. Elena watched with hyper-focused clarity, noting the dangerous shift in the tailored wool. He was silently preparing a defensive countermeasure. He adjusted his lapels, an aristocratic gesture that effectively masked the lethal realignment of his posture. The cold, possessive aura radiating from him intensified, transforming the secluded VIP booth into a volatile staging ground. He did not look at the encroaching enforcers. Instead, his gaze slid back to Elena, locking onto her pale face. The look he gave her stripped away the entire illusion of the fine dining establishment. It was a raw, primal acknowledgement of a life-and-death debt. In that silent exchange, the profound class divide between the exhausted server and the omnipotent underworld king dissolved. He saw the uncontrollable tremor in her hands, recognizing the immense courage it took for her to step directly into the crossfire. Salvatore's massive hand flattened against the polished mahogany, his knuckles turning stark white as he prepared to push off the velvet seat. The atmospheric pressure in the dining room snapped tight. Across the room, the enforcer at the bar pulled his weapon from his shoulder holster, the dark steel, catching a brief glint of chandelier light. The ambush was commencing. But Salvatore was already a lethal force in motion, and as his dark eyes locked onto hers, it became terrifyingly clear that he had absolutely no intention of leaving the brilliant woman who had just saved his life behind in the impending chaos. The chandelier light fractured as a suppressed round shattered the baccarat crystal water glass on the mahogany table, sending a violent spray of diamond-like shards across the dark wood. The sharp crack broke the localized silence of the VIP booth. Before the high society patrons could even register the sudden escalation, Salvatore Moretti erupted into motion. He did not flinch, nor did he waste a fraction of a second seeking cover beneath the table. The casual elegance of the metropolitan billionaire vanished entirely, replaced in a singular heartbeat by the terrifying kinetic efficiency of a seasoned underworld tactician. His massive hand clamped down on Elena Vance's forearm like a steel vice. The shock of his grip was electric, pulling her violently out of the trajectory of a second, muffled shot that tore through the plush velvet backing of his seat. He moved with the undeniable grace of a lethal predator, completely unfazed by the sudden chaos erupting around them. "Move," the Mafia Don commanded. His voice was a low, guttural bark that cut straight through the rising panic of the dining room. Elena's feet moved on pure, adrenaline-fueled autopilot. The sophisticated atmosphere of the obsidian room dissolved into absolute pandemonium. Panicked elites screamed, diving beneath their tables as the enforcer by the bar advanced, weapon drawn. The cowardly manager was already scrambling across the imported marble floor on his hands and knees, abandoning his staff to the crossfire. He whimpered as fine china crashed around him, a stark contrast to the icy composure of the man pulling Elena toward safety. Salvatore stepped smoothly in front of Elena, transforming his broad shoulders into an unyielding shield. His right hand snapped up, revealing a custom matte black sidearm he had drawn with invisible speed from beneath his Salvatore's charcoal suit jacket. He fired twice in rapid succession. The muted pops were instantly followed by the heavy thud of the encroaching enforcer collapsing against a serving station, the threat neutralized before he could even aim. He did not pause, propelling the former forensic auditor toward the swinging doors of the kitchen. A third rival stepped out from the shadows of the heavy velvet drapes, raising a suppressed weapon to block their path. Elena's lungs burned, a scream locking tightly in her throat as her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. But her protector was already calculating the spatial angle. Salvatore didn't break his devastating stride. He adjusted his wrist and fired a single, calculated round, dropping the secondary threat instantly into the shadows. They burst through the heavy brass-plated doors into the commercial kitchen. The temperature spiked violently. The air was thick with the rich scent of sizzling Wagyu beef, burnt brown butter, and now the sharp, metallic tang of cordite. Terrified chefs in white coats scattered like ghosts, abandoning flaming pans and boiling pots of stock that spilled across the floor. Elena struggled to keep her footing on the grease-slick tiles, her breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. Her cheap cotton apron caught on the sharp edge of a steel prep counter, tearing loudly. But the ruthless man refused to let her momentum slow. His situational awareness was absolute. His dark, calculating eyes scanned the chaotic labyrinth of steel racks and hanging copper pots, anticipating secondary ambushes with terrifying precision. "Stay behind me," Salvatore ordered, his grip sliding smoothly from her forearm to engulf her smaller, trembling hand. The contact was incredibly warm, anchoring her hyper-vigilant mind against the suffocating terror of the chase. He did not look back, his massive frame sheltering her entirely from the remaining chaos spilling through the dining room doors. They reached the rear loading dock. Salvatore slammed his shoulder into the heavy steel exit bar, bursting out into the freezing autumn storm. The sudden temperature shift hit Elena like a physical blow, the freezing rain instantly soaking through her thin work clothes and raising goosebumps along her arms. The dark alleyway was a chaotic, narrow choke point, completely isolated from the glamorous, illuminated avenues of Manhattan. Before the remaining enforcers could spill out into the alley behind them, blinding high-beam headlights illuminated the wet asphalt. A massive, heavily armored SUV screeched into the narrow space, its reinforced tires smoking against the rain-slicked pavement. The rear doors flew open before the heavy vehicle even fully stopped. 4 of Salvatore's elite personal guards spilled out into the storm, their weapons raised as they formed an impenetrable defensive line, laying down a deafening barrage of covering fire toward the kitchen exit to suppress Viktor Petrov's approaching men. The underworld king did not relinquish his iron hold on Elena. He shoved her into the expansive cavern of the vehicle's back seat, shielding her vulnerable frame with the heavy, expensive wool of his tailored coat until she was safely inside. He climbed in directly after her, a shadow of lethal grace, and pulled the reinforced door shut. The heavy locking mechanism engaged with a mechanical, vault-like thud. Instantly, the deafening chaos of the gunfight and the howling, freezing wind were entirely severed, leaving them encased in an absolute heavy silence. The interior of the armored sanctuary was a stark, jarring contrast to the violence outside. The climate control hummed softly, flooding the insulated cabin with immediate warmth. The air smelled of rich, dark leather, expensive tobacco, and the faint, lingering trace of Salvatore's signature sandalwood cologne, intermingled with raw gunpowder. Elena collapsed back against the plush seating, her chest heaving violently as she gasped for oxygen. Her knees knocked together in an uncontrollable shiver, the biological aftermath of surviving the lethal ambush, catching up to her nervous system. She stared down at her trembling hands, the red ink from the improvised warning still faintly staining her pale fingertips. Beside her, Salvatore holstered his weapon with clinical, cold precision. He did not immediately issue frantic orders to his driver, who was already accelerating the heavy vehicle smoothly onto the slick metropolitan streets, seamlessly disappearing into the midnight traffic. Instead, his entire focus shifted to the woman shivering beside him. The lethal predator seamlessly transitioned into a hyper-focused, overprotective observer. He leaned closer, his massive frame dominating the confined space of the cabin. His scarred hands reached out, moving with a surprising, deliberate gentleness as they gripped her shoulders. His dark, calculating eyes rapidly scanned her pale face, her torn apron, and her trembling arms, conducting a frantic visual audit for any sign of a bullet wound or hidden injury. "Are you hit?" His low voice carrying a raw, primal edge of concern that completely betrayed his usual aristocratic detachment. The absolute authority in his tone demanded the exact truth. "No," she gasped, her voice barely a rough whisper in the quiet cabin. She forced herself to swallow the dry panic lodged in her throat, her analytical mind fighting to regain control. "No, I am not bleeding. I am just cold." He immediately stripped off his Salvatore's charcoal suit jacket and draped it over her shivering shoulders. The residual heat of his body radiated from the fine wool, wrapping around her like a physical barrier against the terror of the night. She pulled the expensive fabric tighter against her chest, grounding herself in the undeniable reality of her survival. The weight of his jacket felt like a heavy, protective armor. Salvatore leaned back against the plush leather seat, though his intense gaze never left her face. The dim ambient lighting of the cabin cast sharp, dangerous shadows across the rigid lines of his jaw. He watched her fighting to regulate her breathing, noting with profound respect that she had not dissolved into hysterical tears like most civilians would have. She was terrified, yes, but she was fiercely attempting to reassert her own cognitive control, refusing to break. Arthur Gable employs servers, not tactical analysts, the Underworld King stated slowly, the heavy silence in the cabin amplifying the lethal curiosity in his deep tone. Viktor Petrov spent a fortune to bypass my security grid tonight. His men were seasoned professionals, dressed in high-end tailoring, moving in a synchronized formation meant to look exactly like arriving guests. He paused, his dark eyes studying her sharp, intelligent features, piecing together the impossible puzzle of her intervention. So tell me, how exactly did a simple waitress spot a decapitation strike before my own armed perimeter did? Elena closed her eyes for a brief second, forcing her racing heart to steady. The biological instinct to shrink away from the dangerous man beside her was strong, but her intellect refused to be intimidated by his power. She opened her eyes and met his intense stare with a quiet, unyielding defiance. She was no delicate ornament meant to shatter under pressure. She was a survivor forged in the fires of observation and logic. I was an auditor before I was a server, she explained, her voice gaining a fractional layer of strength as her professional confidence bled through the fear. I spent my career tracking systemic anomalies in fraudulent corporate ledgers. When you spend 10 years hunting missing numbers in complex financial structures, you learn how to identify things that are fundamentally out of place. Salvatore remained perfectly still, a statue of pure focus, absorbing every word. And my assassins were an anomaly. Their spatial geometry was entirely wrong, Elena continued, the analytical part of her brain completely taking over, cooling her somatic panic into clinical detachment. Affluent patrons entering a high-end establishment naturally seek out the head waiter or scan the floor for their reserved seating. The 5 men who walked in did not look at the tables or the host stand. They immediately scanned the room's blind spots. They were calculating line-of-sight occlusion. She took a slow, steadying breath, the heavy wool of his jacket comforting her exhausted muscles. Then, there was the weight distribution. Their tailored coats hung asymmetrically. The premium fabric pulled slightly at the shoulders, indicating the heavy, localized weight of concealed hardware. When they split up, 2 of them permanently blocked the private service exit, while the others initiated a slow pincer movement around your booth. They were systematically cutting off your escape routes. It was not a late dinner reservation. It was a tactical cage. The silence inside the armored SUV stretched tight, vibrating with an electric tension. The driver expertly navigated the chaotic, rain-slicked streets, distancing them entirely from the ruined restaurant. Inside the insulated, luxurious cabin, a massive shift in power dynamics was silently, irrevocably occurring. Salvatore stared at the brilliant, resilient woman sitting beside him. He had initially assumed she was merely a highly observant civilian who got lucky. But as she clinically dismantled the multi-million-dollar assassination plot with chilling accuracy, he realized she possessed a formidable tactical intellect. She had read the chaotic high society room like a perfectly structured balance sheet, dissecting the threat before it even materialized. His pupils dilated slightly, a profound realization settling over his cold, aristocratic features. His syndicate employed men trained in violence, hardened soldiers who reacted to physical threats with brute force and endless ammunition. But this exhausted, shivering woman had used pure, unadulterated intellect to save his life. She had risked everything to warn a man she didn't even know, armed with nothing but a sharp mind, a red pen, and a coded receipt. You tracked a physical threat the exact same way you track a financial discrepancy. Salvatore murmured, his voice dropping into a register of deep, possessive respect. You did not just see them. You audited the room. I saw what was happening, Elena replied softly, the massive adrenaline crash finally beginning to pull at her heavy eyelids, her body sagging slightly under the weight of the night. I could not just let them execute you. Salvatore shifted closer, the physical distance between them evaporating in the dimly lit cabin. He did not touch her again, but the sheer gravity of his presence felt like an unbreakable shield forming around her fragile frame. He had lived his entire life in a dark world of betrayal, surrounded by arrogant rivals and greedy subordinates, who smiled to his face while plotting his demise. Yet the purest form of loyalty and genuine protection he had ever encountered had just come from a vulnerable woman in a torn cotton apron. "Your career in hospitality is permanently terminated," the underworld king declared. It was not a suggestion. It was an absolute vow. The quiet, unyielding threat in his tone was meant for the rest of the world, a warning to anyone who might ever try to touch her. But as his dark eyes locked onto hers, his voice softened into a promise of eternal sanctuary. "No one with your intellect will ever carry a silver tray again." The heavy armored SUV tore through the flooded avenues, its reinforced tires slicing through the deep water. Inside the insulated cabin, the chaotic storm was reduced to a muted, rhythmic thumping against the bulletproof glass. The tactical commander in the front passenger seat pressed an earpiece, coordinating the extraction. Salvatore Moretti remained seated beside Elena Vance, his massive frame perfectly still, though his calculating gaze swept over her shivering form. "Boss, the main arteries are choked with municipal plows," the tactical commander reported over his shoulder, the dashboard illuminating the harsh lines of his face. "We are rerouting through the lower transit tunnel. It gives us a straight, covered shot to the primary estate." Elena clutched the lapels of Salvatore's charcoal suit jacket tighter, the residual warmth of his body steadying her erratic pulse. Exhaustion dragged at her bones, but the mention of the lower transit tunnel triggered a sharp spike in her cognitive loop. The forensic auditor inside her refused to shut down. Her mind flashed back to the dining room floor of the obsidian room, rewinding the visual data she had collected seconds before the gunfire erupted. "No," Elena whispered, her voice rough and entirely devoid of its former subservient hospitality tone. The tactical commander paused, glancing in the rearview mirror with a flicker of irritation. A civilian did not interrupt a syndicate extraction protocol, but Salvatore immediately raised a single scarred hand, silencing his lieutenant instantly. The underworld king shifted his full, terrifying focus back to Elena, silently commanding her to continue. "Do not take the lower tunnel," she stated, forcing her breathing to remain perfectly even under the crushing weight of their attention. When the enforcer at the mahogany bar shifted his boots, the ambient lighting illuminated the welt of his footwear. They were stained with fresh, wet red clay, not standard metropolitan street grime. She swallowed hard, connecting the disparate data points with chilling clarity. The city has been excavating the old rail lines directly above the lower transit tunnel for 3 weeks. It is the only active site in this district with exposed red clay. If Viktor Petrov's men staged their assault team there, they prepared a secondary trap. If you drive this armored vehicle into that tunnel, you will be driving directly into an ambush. The heavy silence in the cabin stretched so tight, it felt as though the air pressure had dropped. The tactical commander stared at her through the mirror, his irritation entirely replaced by a stunned absolute reverence. He looked at Salvatore, waiting for the final word. "Reroute," Salvatore commanded, his voice a low, vibrating rumble of absolute authority. "Take the western suspension bridge. Double the perimeter guard." Less than 4 minutes later, the encrypted radio crackled with frantic static. A scout vehicle reported hostile units swarming the entrance of the lower transit tunnel. The trap had been sprung. The tactical team in the front seats collectively exhaled a sharp breath. They looked at the pale woman, wrapped in their boss's wool jacket, not as a rescued civilian, but as a formidable intellectual force. She had just saved the leadership structure of their syndicate twice in one night. Salvatore did not look at the radio. His dark eyes remained locked onto Elena, burning with an intense, possessive pride that stripped away his cold exterior. He had spent his life surrounded by brute force, but her mind was a lethal, exquisite weapon. The convoy passed through massive, reinforced steel gates, entering the sprawling, heavily fortified grounds of the Moretti estate. The transition from the storm to the absolute security of the underworld king's sanctuary was jarring. The SUV came to a smooth halt inside a subterranean garage lined with high-end luxury vehicles and armed guards patrolling the perimeter. Salvatore stepped out first. He reached back inside, offering his large, scarred hand to Elena. She accepted it, the contact grounding her as her legs trembled against the concrete floor. He wrapped a heavy arm around her waist, guiding her toward the private elevator. The biometric scanners flashed green at his approach, sealing them inside a quiet, ascending fortress. The penthouse level was a masterpiece of insulated, gilded luxury. The air was rich with the scent of burning cedar from a massive stone fireplace, and the soft fragrance of aged leather. Positioned in the center of the sprawling study, Elena finally reached back and untied the knot of her torn cotton apron. The cheap, ruined fabric slipped from her waist, falling to the polished marble floor in a silent heap. It was the physical shedding of her invisible, exhausted life. Salvatore moved with deliberate, quiet grace. He retrieved a thick, luxurious cashmere sweater from a private dressing room and gently draped it over her shoulders. The softness of the elite wool was a shocking contrast to the harsh realities she had endured for years. It trapped the heat instantly, calming her erratic nervous system. She pulled the sleeves over her trembling hands, her eyes fluttering shut as profound relief washed over her. "You have spent your entire life mapping the shadows of other people's empires," Salvatore murmured, stepping directly into her personal space. The scent of his sandalwood cologne wrapped around her, heavy and deeply protective. "You notice the details that men blinded by arrogance always ignore." Viktor Petrov thought he could outmaneuver me with sheer violence, but he failed to account for a forensic auditor hiding in plain sight. He stepped closer, his physical presence dominating the quiet room without a single threat. "I do not offer employment, Elena," he stated, his voice a dark, unyielding promise. "I offer a sovereign partnership. From this moment forward, you are the chief security and risk analyst for this syndicate. You will audit my enemies, dismantle their financial structures, predict their tactical movements, and leave them with absolutely nothing." Elena looked up, the red ink from her desperate message still faintly staining her fingertips. The analytical fire reignited in her eyes. She leaned slightly into the solid warmth of his chest, her sharp intellect embracing the dangerous reality of her new life. "Viktor Petrov will try to liquidate his assets by morning to fund another strike," Elena whispered, her voice steady and perfectly clinical. "Give me access to your servers. I will ensure his offshore accounts are frozen before the sun rises." Salvatore's mouth curved into a slow, devastating smile. He pulled her against his chest, yielding his absolute authority to the brilliant woman in his arms. The empire had a new architect, and their enemies were already out of time. 3 months later, heavy snow blanketed the city in a silent white expanse outside the penthouse's bulletproof glass. Inside the Moretti estate, the warmth was absolute. True to her word, Elena had dismantled Viktor Petrov's financial structures. Without his illicit capital, his faction crumpled from the inside out. Salvatore had executed a methodical acquisition of the remaining territories, permanently neutralizing the threat and leaving Viktor in the ashes of his own arrogance. Resting in the center of the sprawling mahogany study, the rich scent of aged cedar wrapped around them, Salvatore reached into a velvet-lined humidor box, resting on his heavy desk. When his hand returned, he was holding the Moretti signet ring. It was a thick band of solid platinum, deeply etched with the ancient crest of his syndicate, a physical manifestation of unyielding power. He took her left hand, his thumb gently brushing across her smooth knuckles. The bruises and exhaustion from her former life were completely gone, replaced by the quiet confidence of a woman commanding an empire. With slow, deliberate reverence, he slid the heavy platinum ring onto her finger. The cold metal quickly warmed against her skin, an undeniable weight that anchored her permanently to his dark, fiercely protective world. Elena looked down at the ring, reflecting on the journey from the claustrophobic dining floor of the obsidian room to this gilded fortress. She had started that fateful evening as an invisible waitress, desperate to survive. Now, she stood as a fully realized sovereign partner, crowned by the city's most feared predator. She did not pull her hand away. Instead, she stepped fully into his embrace. Her brilliant mind and his lethal strength merged into a single, unbreakable force. She was no longer the invisible girl sweeping up broken glass. She was the architect of his empire. Do you think Elena made the right choice in embracing Salvatore's dark world or should she have run from his shadow? Leave a comment below, and subscribe to never miss the next chapter of their reign.